Maria Santos walked slowly down the cracked sidewalk, her worn shoes making soft sounds against the concrete. The evening air was thick with humidity, and sweat beaded on her dark skin despite the late hour. She clutched a small paper bag containing a loaf of day-old bread and a can of soup, all she could afford with the few dollars she had left. The streetlights flickered weakly in this forgotten part of the city, casting long shadows between abandoned buildings and empty lots. Maria had lived in this neighborhood for 3 years now, ever since losing her job at the factory and then her apartment. The tiny room she rented above the old laundromat cost almost everything she earned from cleaning offices at night. As she turned the corner toward her building, something caught her eye. A figure lay motionless on the ground near the old bus stop. Maria's first instinct was to keep walking. In this neighborhood, you learned not to get involved in other people's problems. But something made her pause. The person wasn't moving at all. No shifting, no groaning, nothing. Maria looked around the empty street, then slowly approached. As she got closer, she could see it was a young man, maybe in his early 20s. His clothes were expensive, much too expensive for this part of town. A leather jacket that probably cost more than Maria made in 6 months. Designer jeans, and shoes that looked like they'd never touched a dirty sidewalk before tonight. The young man was pale, very pale, with light brown hair that fell across his forehead. His breathing was shallow and rapid. Maria knelt beside him, her heart racing. She'd seen enough unconscious people in her life to know this wasn't from drinking or drugs. This looked like someone who was seriously hurt or sick. She gently shook his shoulder. "Hey, can you hear me?" No response. She tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. Maria noticed a thin trickle of blood coming from somewhere behind his head. Her hands trembled as she reached into her pocket for her old flip phone. She started to dial 911, then stopped. The ambulance would come, yes, but they'd also ask questions. And in this neighborhood, questions meant police. Police meant trouble for people like Maria. People without proper documentation, people living in the shadows. She looked at the unconscious young man again. His wallet had fallen partially out of his pocket. Maria hesitated, then carefully pulled it out. She wasn't a thief, but she needed to know who this person was. Maybe there was someone she could call. Someone who could help him without involving the authorities. She opened the wallet with shaking hands. The first thing she saw was a driver's license. The photo matched the face of the unconscious man. Thomas Brennan, age 22, from the wealthy Riverside district across town. But it was the second item that made Maria's blood run cold. A business card fell out of the wallet onto the ground. She picked it up and read the name printed in elegant letters. Patrick Brennan, Import-Export Business. Maria knew that name. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that name, even if they pretended not to. Patrick Brennan wasn't just any businessman. He controlled most of the illegal activities in the eastern part of the city. Drugs, gambling, protection rackets. If it made money and broke the law, Brennan had his fingers in it. The police either couldn't touch him or didn't want to try. He was dangerous, powerful, and not the kind of man you wanted to cross. And here was his son, lying unconscious on the street in the worst part of town. Maria sat back on her heels, staring at the business card. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. How had Thomas Brennan ended up here? This wasn't the kind of place rich white kids from Riverside visited, especially not alone at night. Had someone attacked him? Kidnapped him and dumped him here? Or had he come here on his own for some reason? She looked around the empty street again. Whatever had happened, Thomas was in serious trouble. His breathing was getting more shallow, and the blood behind his head was still flowing. He needed medical attention fast, but calling an ambulance would bring questions she couldn't answer, and attention she couldn't afford. Maria made a decision that would change her life forever. She pulled out her phone again, but instead of dialing 911, she called information. Her voice shook as she asked for the number of Brennan Import-Export. The operator connected her, and after 3 rings, a gruff voice answered. Brennan's office. "I need to speak with Patrick Brennan," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Brennan doesn't take calls from people he doesn't know." "Who is this?" Maria took a deep breath. "My name is Maria Santos. I'm calling about his son Thomas. He's hurt and he needs help right now." There was a long pause on the other end. Then the voice became very serious. "Where are you?" Maria gave him the address, describing the bus stop and the nearby landmarks. The man told her to stay exactly where she was and not to call anyone else. The line went dead. As she waited, Maria stayed beside Thomas, checking his pulse and trying to keep him comfortable. She used her jacket as a pillow under his head, being careful of the injury. His skin was getting paler and she could see he was going into shock. 20 minutes later, 3 black cars pulled up to the curb. Men in dark suits got out quickly, moving with the efficiency of people used to handling emergencies. The first man to reach her was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and cold blue eyes. Even before he spoke, Maria knew this was Patrick Brennan himself. "You're the one who called?" he asked, kneeling beside his son. "Yes, sir," Maria replied, stepping back to give him room. Brennan checked Thomas's pulse and lifted his eyelids to look at his pupils. "How long has he been like this?" "I found him maybe 30 minutes ago. He was already unconscious." 2 of Brennan's men carefully lifted Thomas and carried him to one of the cars. Brennan stood up slowly, his eyes studying Maria carefully. She could feel the weight of his attention, and it frightened her more than anything she'd ever experienced. "You could have just walked away," he said quietly. Most people in this neighborhood would have. Maria didn't know what to say. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling very small and vulnerable. "You saved my son's life tonight," Brennan continued. "That means something to me. It means I owe you a debt." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick roll of bills. "This is for calling me instead of the police, for staying with him, for doing the right thing." Maria stared at the money. It was more cash than she'd seen in years. "I don't want money," she said quietly. "I just wanted to help." Brennan looked surprised. "Everyone wants money." "I just hope your son is okay." For the first time, something like respect flickered in Brennan's cold eyes. He put the money back in his pocket and handed her a business card instead. "If you ever need anything, call this number. Ask for me personally." As the cars drove away into the night, Maria stood alone on the empty street, holding Patrick Brennan's business card and wondering what she had gotten herself into. 3 weeks passed, and Maria tried to put the strange encounter out of her mind. She kept Patrick Brennan's business card hidden in her small jewelry box, under the few pieces her grandmother had left her. Every time she saw it, she felt a mixture of fear and curiosity. What kind of man was Patrick Brennan, really? Was his son okay? And why had Thomas been in her neighborhood that night? Her life continued its difficult routine. She cleaned offices from midnight to 6 in the morning, came home exhausted, slept until afternoon, then looked for day work wherever she could find it. The money was never enough. Her landlord, Mr. Kim, had already warned her twice about late rent. The electricity had been turned off for 3 days last week, until she could scrape together enough for a partial payment. On a rainy Thursday morning, as Maria walked home from her cleaning job, she noticed something different about her neighborhood. There were new faces around, men in nice cars who didn't belong on these broken streets. They weren't causing trouble, just watching, waiting. Maria had grown up in neighborhoods like this. She knew the signs when someone powerful was paying attention to an area. When she reached her building, she found Mrs. Rodriguez from the apartment below standing in the hallway, wringing her hands nervously. "Maria, thank God you're here," the elderly woman said in Spanish. "Some men came looking for you yesterday. They left this." Mrs. Rodriguez handed her an envelope with her name written on it in elegant handwriting. Inside was a simple note. "Thomas is recovering well. I would like to meet with you to express my gratitude properly. Tonight, 8 p.m., Rosario's restaurant on 5th Street. Come alone. P. Brennan." Maria's hands shook as she read the note. Rosario's was an expensive Italian restaurant in the business district, the kind of place she'd never been able to afford. Why did Patrick Brennan want to meet with her? She'd helped his son. He'd offered her money. She'd refused. Shouldn't that be the end of it? But she knew it wasn't that simple. Men like Brennan didn't just forget about people. They kept track of debts, both the ones they owed and the ones owed to them. Maria had seen enough movies to know that when a crime boss wanted to meet with you, it wasn't really a request. She spent the day in her small room, staring at the note and trying to decide what to do. She could run, take what little money she had and leave town. But where would she go? She had no family, no connections outside the city, and Brennan's men had already found her once. They could find her again. As evening approached, Maria made her choice. She would go to the meeting. She put on her best dress, a simple black one she'd worn to job interviews, and her only pair of good shoes. Looking at herself in the cracked mirror, she hardly recognized the woman staring back. Fear had changed her face, made her eyes look older and more cautious. Rosario's restaurant was everything Maria had imagined and more. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and every table was set with white linen and expensive silverware. The hostess, a young blonde woman in an elegant dress, looked at Maria with barely concealed surprise when she gave her name. "Oh yes, Mr. Brennan is expecting you. Right this way, please." She led Maria through the main dining room, past tables of well-dressed couples eating meals that probably cost more than Maria made in a week. They went up a flight of stairs to a private dining room, where Patrick Brennan sat alone at a table set for two. He stood when she entered, which surprised her. In her world, men like Brennan didn't stand for women like her. He was wearing an expensive gray suit, and in the soft lighting of the restaurant, he looked less threatening than he had that night on the street. But Maria could still see the hardness in his eyes, the careful way he watched everything around him. "Mrs. Santos, thank you for coming. Please sit." The hostess left them alone, closing the door behind her. Maria sat carefully in the chair across from Brennan, her hands folded in her lap. "I took the liberty of ordering dinner," Brennan said, pouring red wine into both glasses. "I hope you like Italian food." "I've never really had it," Maria admitted quietly. Brennan smiled slightly. "Then this will be an education for both of us. I wanted to tell you about Thomas." As if on cue, waiters appeared with the first course, a soup Maria couldn't identify, but that smelled wonderful. She waited for Brennan to start eating before picking up her own spoon. "The doctors say he had a severe concussion," Brennan continued. "A few more hours and there might have been permanent brain damage. Or worse." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Maria could hear the emotion underneath. "You saved my son's life. How is he now?" Maria asked. "Better. He's awake, talking. He doesn't remember much about that night, which is probably for the best." Brennan paused, studying her face. "Can I ask you something, Mrs. Santos?" "Why didn't you just take his wallet and walk away? It would have been easier. Safer." Maria thought about the question while she ate the soup, which was delicious and creamy. "My grandmother raised me," she said finally. "She always told me that how you treat people when no one is watching shows who you really are. That boy was hurt and alone. I couldn't just leave him there. Even knowing who he was? Who his father was. I didn't know at first. And when I found out, I was scared. But he was still just a hurt person who needed help." Brennan nodded slowly. "My son told me something interesting when he was feeling better. He said he'd been having dreams while he was unconscious. Dreams about a woman with kind eyes who stayed with him, who wouldn't let him give up. He said she had a voice like his grandmother, warm and safe." The main course arrived, some kind of pasta with seafood that Maria had never seen before. She ate carefully, trying not to embarrass herself with the unfamiliar utensils. "I want to offer you a job," Brennan said suddenly. Maria nearly choked on her wine. "A job?" "Nothing illegal," he said quickly, as if reading her thoughts. "I have several legitimate businesses. Real estate, restaurants, import companies. I need someone I can trust to manage the household staff at my home. Someone who knows how to take care of people, who has good judgment. Mr. Brennan, I don't know anything about managing household staff. I clean offices. You can learn. The pay would be 5 times what you're making now, plus room and board. You'd have your own apartment above the garage, completely private." Maria stared at him. It sounded too good to be true, which in her experience meant it probably was. "Why me? You could hire anyone you wanted. I told you already. You saved my son's life, but more than that, you did it because it was the right thing to do. Not because you expected anything in return. That kind of character is rare in my world." "What would I really be doing?" Maria asked carefully. "Really?" Brennan was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass. "Taking care of my family, making sure my home is a place where Thomas can recover properly. Being someone I can trust completely in my private life. And if I say no, then you say no. You go back to your life and we never see each other again. No threats, no consequences. You saved my son. That debt doesn't disappear just because you refuse my offer." Maria looked around the elegant dining room, then back at Patrick Brennan. He was a dangerous man, she had no doubt about that. But he was also a father who loved his son, and he was offering her a chance at a life she'd never dreamed possible. "I need to think about it," she said. "Of course, but don't think too long. Thomas is coming home from the hospital next week, and I'd like to have everything settled by then." He handed her another business card, this one with a different number written on the back. "Call me when you've decided." day or night. As they finished dinner, Brennan told her more about his family. Thomas was his only child. His wife had died 5 years ago in a car accident, and since then, it had been just the two of them. He was worried about his son, who had been struggling since his mother's death. Getting into fights, hanging around with the wrong people, taking unnecessary risks. "I think that's how he ended up in your neighborhood that night," Brennan said as they prepared to leave. "He's been rebelling against everything I try to do to keep him safe." A car was waiting outside the restaurant to take Maria home. As they drove through the city, she watched the neighborhoods change from wealthy to middle class to poor. By the time they reached her building, she had made up her mind. She would take Patrick Brennan's job offer. It was dangerous, and she didn't fully understand what she was getting into. But it was also her chance to escape the endless cycle of poverty and worry that had defined her life for so long, and maybe, just maybe, she could help a broken family heal. Maria called Patrick Brennan the next morning. Her voice was steady as she told him she would take the job, but her hands shook as she hung up the phone. Within 2 hours, men arrived at her building to help her pack her few belongings. By evening, she was standing in front of the largest house she had ever seen. The Brennan estate sat on 5 acres in the hills outside the city, surrounded by high walls and electronic gates. The main house was built of gray stone with tall windows and ivy climbing the walls. It looked like something from a movie about rich people, the kind of place Maria had only seen on television. Patrick Brennan met her at the front door, looking different in casual clothes, jeans and a sweater instead of his business suit. He seemed more relaxed here, though Maria could still sense the careful control in everything he did. "Welcome to your new home," he said, leading her inside. The interior was even more impressive than the outside. High ceilings, expensive paintings on the walls, furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum. But despite all the luxury, something felt empty about the space, as if it was more like a hotel than a home where people actually lived. "Let me show you around," Brennan said. "Then we'll go to your apartment." The tour took almost an hour. There were 12 bedrooms, 6 bathrooms, a library, a formal dining room that seated 20 people, and a kitchen bigger than Maria's entire former apartment. Brennan explained that they rarely used most of the rooms anymore. Just the kitchen, his bedroom, Thomas's bedroom, and a small sitting room where they sometimes watched television together. "We have a cleaning service that comes twice a week," he told her, "and a gardener for the grounds. But I need someone here all the time, someone who understands how to make a house feel like a home again." Her apartment was above the 3-car garage, reached by an outside staircase. It was small but comfortable, with a living room, bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom. The furniture was simple but nice, much better than anything Maria had ever owned. Large windows looked out over the gardens, and she could see the city lights twinkling in the distance. "The previous housekeeper left all the linens and dishes," Brennan said. "If you need anything else, just let me know." That first night, Maria lay awake in her new bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the wealthy neighborhood. No sirens, no shouting from the street, no music playing too loud from other apartments, just the whisper of wind in the trees and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. It was peaceful, but also strange and lonely. The next morning, she met Thomas for the first time since that night on the street. He came down to the kitchen while she was making coffee, moving slowly and carefully. He looked much better than when she'd found him unconscious, but she could see he was still recovering. There was a bandage on the back of his head, and he moved like someone who was still in pain. "You must be Maria," he said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Dad told me what you did." "Thank you." Up close, Thomas looked even younger than his 22 years. He had his father's blue eyes, but none of the hardness. Instead, Maria saw sadness there and something else. A lost quality that reminded her of homeless kids she'd known on the streets. "How are you feeling?" she asked, pouring him a cup of coffee. "Like I got hit by a truck. The doctors say the headaches will go away eventually." He studied her face curiously. "Dad said you lived in the neighborhood where you found me. What were you doing out so late?" "I work nights. I clean offices downtown." She paused. "Can I ask you something? What were you doing there? It's not exactly a safe place for someone like you." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "I was looking for someone. A guy who owed me money from a poker game. Word was he lived around there somewhere." He looked up at her with a rueful smile. "Stupid, right? Going into that neighborhood alone at night, asking questions about someone who didn't want to be found." "Very stupid," Maria agreed, but her tone was gentle. Did you find him? No. Last thing I remember is parking my car and starting to walk around looking for the right address. Next thing I knew, I was in the hospital with Dad sitting next to my bed looking like he'd aged 10 years. Over the next few weeks, Maria settled into her new role. Her official job was managing the household, but in reality, she spent most of her time simply being present. She cooked meals that Thomas would actually eat, simple, comforting food instead of the elaborate dishes the previous housekeeper had prepared. She made sure he took his medications and got enough rest. Most importantly, she listened when he wanted to talk and gave him space when he didn't. Patrick Brennan was gone most days, handling his various business interests. But in the evenings, he would come home and the three of them would often eat dinner together. At first, these meals were awkward and formal. But gradually, as Maria relaxed and stopped feeling like an intruder, they began to feel more like a real family. She learned more about both men during these dinners. Thomas had been studying business in college but had dropped out after his mother's death. Since then, he'd been drifting, getting into trouble, refusing his father's attempts to help him find direction. Patrick, for his part, was struggling to balance his love for his son with his frustration at Thomas's reckless behavior. I keep waiting for him to grow up, Patrick told Maria one evening when Thomas had gone upstairs early with another headache. But every time I think he's getting better, he does something else to scare me. He's grieving, Maria said quietly. And he's young. Young people don't always grieve in ways that make sense to adults. How do you know so much about grief? Patrick asked. Maria was quiet for a moment. I lost my parents when I was 16. Car accident. My grandmother took me in, but it was hard. I spent a lot of years being angry and making bad choices before I figured out how to live with the loss. What changed? Time mostly. And my grandmother's patience. She never gave up on me, even when I gave up on myself. Patrick nodded slowly. Thomas blames me for his mother's death. She was coming home from meeting with my lawyer when the accident happened. If she hadn't been involved in my business, it wasn't your fault, Maria said firmly. Accidents happen. You can't control everything, no matter how much power you have. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged directly what Patrick's business really involved. They looked at each other across the dinner table, and Maria saw something like gratitude in his eyes. As Thomas's physical recovery continued, Maria began to see glimpses of the person he might become if he could work through his grief and anger. He was intelligent and funny when he wasn't lost in his own darkness. He had his father's sharp mind, but also a gentleness that Patrick's harder life had worn away. One afternoon, Maria found Thomas in the library, reading one of his father's business books. He looked up when she came in with tea and sandwiches. Dad wants me to work for him, he said. Start at the bottom and learn the legitimate businesses. What do you want? Maria asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I want to stop feeling like I'm floating, like nothing I do matters, but I also don't want to become him. Does that make sense? Perfect sense. You don't have to become your father to make your life matter. There are other ways to use the advantages you have. Like what? That's something you have to figure out for yourself. But you're smart and you have resources most people don't. You could do almost anything you wanted. That evening at dinner, Thomas surprised both Maria and his father by saying he'd decided to go back to college in the fall. Not business school, but social work. Social work, Patrick repeated, his voice carefully neutral. I want to help kids who are in trouble, kids like I was after Mom died. Kids who don't have anyone to catch them when they fall. Patrick was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, the first real smile Maria had seen from him. Your mother would have loved that idea. Later that night, as Maria was cleaning up the kitchen, Patrick came to find her. I don't know how you did it, he said. In 6 weeks, you've accomplished what I couldn't do in 2 years. You gave him hope again. I didn't do anything special. I just listened to him and treated him like his feelings mattered. That's more special than you think. Patrick paused, then said quietly, I have another favor to ask you. Thomas is going back to school, but he's still fragile. Would you consider going with him as, I don't know what to call it officially, a companion? Someone to make sure he's okay while he gets back on his feet. Maria looked at this powerful, dangerous man who was really just a worried father, and realized that somehow, in saving his son's life, she had found a new life of her own. A life where she mattered, where her choices made a difference. Yes, she said, I'll go with him. The university town was different from anything Maria had experienced. Clean streets lined with coffee shops and bookstores. Students hurrying between classes with backpacks and laptops. Professors in tweed jackets walking slowly while deep in thought. It felt like stepping into another world, one where people worried about grades and graduation instead of rent money and where their next meal would come from. Patrick had rented a small house near campus for Thomas and Maria. It was modest by Brennan family standards, but luxurious compared to anywhere Maria had ever lived. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living room with built-in bookshelves. The arrangement was unusual. Maria wasn't exactly a nanny since Thomas was an adult, but she wasn't just a housekeeper either. They had settled on calling her a family assistant, though neither of them was entirely sure what that meant. Thomas threw himself into his studies with an intensity that sometimes worried Maria. He took a full course load and spent hours each night reading textbooks about child psychology, social services, and family counseling. It was as if he was trying to make up for the 2 years he had lost to grief and anger. "You don't have to prove anything to anyone," Maria told him one evening when she found him still studying at midnight. "I have to prove it to myself," Thomas replied without looking up from his textbook. "I need to know I can do something meaningful with my life." The other students didn't know what to make of Thomas. He was older than most of them, and while he didn't talk about his family's wealth, it showed in small ways. His clothes, his car, the expensive laptop he used to take notes. But he also had a seriousness that set him apart from the typical college experience. He didn't go to parties or join clubs. He just attended classes and studied. Maria found her own routine in the college town. She enrolled in a few community college courses, basic computer skills and business math. It had been years since she had been in school, and at first she felt overwhelmed and out of place. But gradually she discovered she enjoyed learning, and her teachers were impressed by her dedication. 3 months into the semester, their quiet life was disrupted by an unexpected visit. Maria was making dinner when she heard a car pull into the driveway. Through the kitchen window, she saw Patrick Brennan getting out of a black sedan, his face grim. "Dad?" Thomas looked up from his homework, surprised. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay?" Patrick came inside without his usual composed demeanor. He looked tired and older than Maria remembered. "We need to talk. Both of you." They sat in the small living room, and Patrick explained the situation. One of his business rivals, a man named Vincent Russo, was making moves against the Brennan organization. There had been threats, and Patrick had reason to believe Russo might try to target Thomas to get to him. "I want you both to come home," Patrick said, "at least until this situation is resolved." "No." Thomas's response was immediate and firm. "I'm not running away from school because of your business problems. This isn't about business, Thomas. This is about keeping you alive. Then maybe it's time you got out of that business." The argument that followed was intense but quiet. Both men had learned to fight with words rather than raised voices. Patrick tried to explain that it wasn't that simple, that he had obligations and responsibilities that went back decades. Thomas countered that nothing was more important than being able to live without fear. Maria listened to them go back and forth, seeing the love and frustration on both sides. Finally, she spoke up. "What if we compromised?" she said. "What if Thomas stayed in school but we increased security? Made it harder for anyone to get to him?" Patrick looked at her with interest. "What did you have in mind? You have people you trust, right? People who could keep an eye on things without being obvious about it, and maybe we could change our routine, be less predictable." Thomas wasn't happy about the idea of being watched, but he agreed it was better than leaving school. Patrick arranged for 2 of his most reliable men to take turns monitoring the house and campus, staying far enough back to give Thomas space but close enough to respond if there was trouble. The security measures proved to be necessary sooner than anyone expected. 2 weeks after Patrick's visit, Maria noticed a car that seemed to appear wherever she and Thomas went. Different drivers, but always the same dark blue sedan with tinted windows. She called Patrick immediately. Within hours, his security team had identified the car and its occupants, men working for Vincent Russo. The situation escalated quickly after that. The first direct threat came in the form of a phone call to the house. Maria answered. and a voice she didn't recognize told her that Thomas had 48 hours to come home to his father, or accidents might start happening to people he cared about. Maria felt a chill run through her. She had worked so hard to build a normal, peaceful life for Thomas and herself. Now the violent world of Patrick's business was intruding again. "We have to tell your father," she said after hanging up the phone. "I know." Thomas looked pale and shaken. "But I'm not going home. I won't let them control my life." That evening, Patrick arrived with 6 men in 2 cars. The small house suddenly felt crowded and tense. Patrick was in full crime boss mode now, cold, efficient, and dangerous. It was a side of him Maria had seen hints of but never experienced directly. "Pack your things," he told Thomas. "We're leaving in an hour." "No," Thomas said again, but this time his voice was less certain. "This isn't a discussion anymore. Russo's people called. They threatened Maria directly. You want to risk her life for your college degree?" Thomas looked at Maria with anguish. She could see him struggling between his desire to live his own life and his need to protect her. It wasn't fair, none of this was fair. "What if I left?" Maria said quietly. "What if I went somewhere safe while you two figured this out? Thomas could stay in school and no one would have leverage over either of you." "No," both men said simultaneously. "Maria, you're part of this family now," Patrick said. "We don't abandon family. And I'm not letting you disappear because of my problems," Thomas added. Looking at them, Maria realized something had changed over the past months. She wasn't just an employee anymore or even just a friend. She had become something she had never expected to be again, someone's family. Someone worth protecting and fighting for. "Then what do we do?" she asked. Patrick was quiet for a long moment, thinking. "We end this," he said finally. "Russo wants a war. He'll get one. But it ends quickly, and it ends with him understanding that my family is off limits forever." The next week was tense and strange. Thomas tried to continue attending classes, but he was surrounded by bodyguards who did their best to be invisible. Maria stayed close to the house, venturing out only when necessary and always with protection. Patrick commuted back and forth between the college town and the city, coordinating his response to Russo's threats. Maria could see the strain on him. He was trying to handle a dangerous situation while keeping his son and her safe and out of the violence. The resolution came suddenly, and, from Maria's perspective, mysteriously. One morning, Patrick arrived at the house looking relieved but exhausted. "It's over," he announced. "Russo won't be bothering us anymore." "What happened?" Thomas asked. He realized he was outmatched. Sometimes these things end with negotiations rather than bloodshed. Maria suspected there was more to the story than Patrick was sharing, but she didn't ask for details. She was simply grateful that the threat was gone and they could return to something like normal life. That evening, as they sat down for dinner together for the first time in weeks without bodyguards stationed outside, Patrick made an announcement that surprised both Maria and Thomas. "I've been thinking about what Thomas said, about getting out of certain aspects of my business." He looked at his son, then at Maria. "This situation with Russo made me realize that no amount of money or power is worth putting the people I love in danger." Thomas set down his fork, staring at his father. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm going to start transitioning out of the illegal operations. It won't happen overnight. These things take time and careful planning. But I want to focus on the legitimate businesses. Real estate, the restaurants, the import company that actually imports legal goods." Maria could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had seen enough of Patrick's world to know that men in his position rarely just walked away from the criminal life. It was dangerous to leave, and it was hard to give up that kind of power and money. "Why now?" she asked. Patrick was quiet for a moment, cutting his food carefully. "Because I almost lost the only family I have left. Because I realized that all the money and power in the world means nothing if you can't sleep at night, because you're worried about the people you love." Over the following months, Maria watched Patrick carefully orchestrate his exit from the criminal world. It was like watching a master chess player, thinking dozens of moves ahead, slowly extracting himself from complicated relationships and obligations. Some of his former associates weren't happy about his decision, but Patrick had been smart and careful. He had enough information and enough allies to make his departure relatively smooth. Thomas flourished as the pressure of his father's reputation lifted. His grades improved and he began making friends among his classmates. He even started dating a girl named Sarah who was studying education. When he brought her home to meet Maria and his father, it was clear that he was becoming the man he was meant to be. Confident but not arrogant, ambitious but not ruthless. Maria continued her own education, eventually enrolling in a bachelor's degree program in social work. She found she had a natural talent for counseling and helping people navigate difficult situations. Her professors encouraged her to consider graduate school, something that would have been unthinkable just a year earlier. The three of them had found an unusual but genuine family dynamic. Patrick remained the patriarch, but he consulted both Maria and Thomas on important decisions. Maria had become the heart of their small family, the one who kept them connected to each other and to their better selves. Thomas was growing into his role as a bridge between his father's old world and the new life they were all building together. One evening in late spring, as Maria was studying for finals and Thomas was working on a paper about trauma in children, Patrick came home with news that would change everything again. "I've been offered a position," he said over dinner. "CEO of a nonprofit organization that works with at-risk youth. It would mean using all my business experience, but for something completely different. Would you take it?" Thomas asked. "I'm thinking about it. But it would mean relocating to Chicago. All of us, if you're willing." Maria felt a familiar flutter of uncertainty. Just as she was getting comfortable with her life, everything was changing again. But looking at Patrick and Thomas, she realized that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Change had brought her everything good in her life. From that night when she decided to help an unconscious stranger to the moment she chose to take Patrick's job offer. "I think we should do it," she said. "All of us together." Thomas grinned. "A fresh start for the whole family." Patrick smiled, and Maria could see the relief in his eyes. He had been worried about how they would react, but he should have known better. They had become a team, and teams stuck together. As they began planning for their move to Chicago, Maria reflected on how much had changed since that night she found Thomas unconscious on the street. She had been a woman with no family, no prospects, and no hope for anything better. Now she was part of a family that, while unconventional, was built on genuine love and mutual support. Patrick had transformed from a dangerous crime boss into a man dedicated to legitimate business and helping others. Thomas had evolved from a lost young man into someone with purpose and direction. And Maria herself had discovered strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed. The night before they left for Chicago, the three of them sat on the porch of the little house near campus, watching the sunset and talking about their plans for the future. It felt like the end of one story and the beginning of another, which Maria supposed was exactly what it was. Chicago was a revelation for all three of them. The nonprofit organization that Patrick now led was called Second Chances, and it worked with teenagers who had been in trouble with the law. Many of these kids came from backgrounds similar to Maria's old neighborhood: poverty, broken families, limited opportunities, and the constant pressure to make bad choices just to survive. Patrick threw himself into his new role with the same intensity he had once brought to his criminal enterprises. But instead of intimidating people and making deals in shadowy rooms, he was now sitting in boardrooms trying to convince wealthy donors to fund after-school programs and job training initiatives. The skills transferred surprisingly well: reading people, understanding motivations, negotiating complex agreements. The main difference was that now he was using those skills to help people, instead of exploit them. Maria enrolled in graduate school at the University of Chicago, working toward her master's degree in social work. The program was challenging, but she found that her life experiences gave her insights that many of her younger classmates lacked. When they studied theories about poverty and trauma, Maria had lived them. When they discussed family dynamics and dysfunction, she could draw on her work with the Brennan family, as well as her own difficult childhood. Thomas finished his undergraduate degree and immediately applied to graduate programs in social work as well. He wanted to specialize in working with children who had experienced loss, drawing on his own journey through grief and recovery. Sarah, his girlfriend, had moved to Chicago with them and was teaching elementary school in one of the city's most challenging districts. The four of them, Patrick, Maria, Thomas, and Sarah, had created an unconventional but close-knit family unit. They lived in a large house in a nice neighborhood, but it felt more like a home than the mansion back in their old city ever had. They cooked together, celebrated holidays together, and supported each other through the challenges of their new lives. 6 months after arriving in Chicago, Maria was doing her field placement at a community center in a neighborhood that reminded her painfully of where she had grown up. The building was old and underfunded, but the staff was dedicated to helping families who had nowhere else to turn. It was there that she met Keisha, a 15-year-old girl whose situation struck Maria as eerily familiar. Keisha's mother had died 2 years earlier, and she was living with her grandmother in a tiny apartment. The grandmother was doing her best, but she was elderly and overwhelmed. Keisha was angry, skipping school and hanging around with older kids who were involved in petty crime. She reminded Maria of herself at that age, smart and capable but trapped by circumstances beyond her control. "She reminds me of someone I used to know," Maria told Patrick over dinner one evening after describing her day at the community center. "Who?" Patrick asked. "Me," Maria said simply. "Same situation, same anger, same feeling that the world doesn't care whether she succeeds or fails." Patrick set down his fork and looked at her carefully. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that maybe we could help her. Not just as professionals, but as people who understand what she's going through." Thomas looked up from his own meal. "You want to take her in?" "I want to give her what your father gave me. A chance to see that there's another way to live. An opportunity to break the cycle." The process of becoming Keisha's foster family was complicated and lengthy. There were background checks, home visits, interviews, and mountains of paperwork. Patrick's past made things especially difficult. Even though he had left his criminal life behind, the authorities were skeptical about placing a vulnerable teenager in his home. But Maria's social work supervisor went to bat for them, and Patrick's work with second chances had given him credibility in the nonprofit world. Slowly, the pieces came together. Keisha was suspicious and hostile when she first moved in. She had been disappointed by adults too many times to trust easily. She tested every boundary, broke several rules, and made it clear that she expected to be sent away as soon as she became too much trouble. "Why are you doing this?" she asked Maria one evening after a particularly difficult day. She had been caught smoking in her room and had responded to Maria's gentle correction with a stream of profanity that would have made a sailor blush. "Because someone did it for me once," Maria replied, "and because I see something in you that's worth fighting for even if you don't see it yet. What if I don't want to be saved?" "Then you don't have to be, but you have to follow the rules while you're living here, and you have to give yourself a chance to see what's possible." Slowly, very slowly, Keisha began to open up. She was brilliant, much smarter than her grades suggested, and she had a fierce loyalty to the few people she allowed herself to care about. Patrick worked with her on her homework, using his business experience to help her understand math and economics. Thomas taught her to drive and listened when she wanted to talk about missing her mother. Sarah helped her catch up on the reading she had missed during her months of skipping school. But it was Maria who became Keisha's anchor. Maria understood the anger and the fear that drove so many of Keisha's bad choices. She had felt the same helplessness, the same conviction that nothing she did would ever matter, and she knew how to wait patiently for trust to develop. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening 6 months after Keisha had moved in. Maria found her crying in her room, clutching a letter that had come in the mail. "What's wrong?" Maria asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. "It's from my mom's lawyer," Keisha said through her tears. "There's a life insurance policy I didn't know about. Not much, but enough to pay for college if I can get my grades up." "That's wonderful news." "Why are you crying?" "Because she knew," Keisha whispered. "Even when she was sick, even when she was dying, she was still trying to take care of me. And I've been so angry at her for leaving me." Maria held the girl while she sobbed, remembering her own complicated feelings about her parents' death. Grief was never simple, especially for young people who didn't yet have the tools to process such enormous loss. "She would be proud of you," Maria said quietly. "You're still here, you're still fighting." That's what she wanted, for you to have a chance at a good life. That night marked a turning point. Keisha began taking her education seriously, bringing up her grades and talking about her plans for the future. She wanted to study journalism, to tell stories about people who were often overlooked or ignored by mainstream media. As Keisha flourished, Maria realized that their little family had come full circle. Patrick had gone from being a man who profited from other people's desperation to someone who dedicated his life to helping them find hope. Thomas had transformed his own experience with loss into a calling to help other children navigate trauma. Sarah brought her natural teaching ability and endless patience to their home, and Maria had evolved from a woman who cleaned up other people's messes to someone who helped clean up the deeper messes in people's lives, the emotional and psychological damage that poverty and trauma could cause. One evening in late spring, as they sat around the dinner table discussing Keisha's college plans and Thomas's upcoming graduation from his master's program, Maria looked around at the faces of her chosen family and felt a profound sense of gratitude. "I want to say something," she announced, causing everyone to look at her with curiosity. 2 years ago, I was walking home from my night job when I found Thomas unconscious on the street. I thought I was just helping a stranger, but really I was finding my way to all of you, to this life, this family, this purpose. Patrick reached over and squeezed her hand. "You saved more than just Thomas that night. You saved all of us." "We saved each other," Maria corrected. "That's what families do." Keisha, who was still sometimes uncomfortable with emotional displays, rolled her eyes but smiled. "You guys are so corny. But I guess I love you too." They all laughed, and the moment passed into the easy conversation of people who had learned to trust each other completely. Outside, the Chicago skyline glittered in the distance, full of possibilities that none of them could have imagined just a few years earlier. Maria thought about the woman she had been before that fateful night, lonely, struggling, convinced that her life would never amount to anything significant. That woman could never have imagined sitting at this table, part of this family, making plans to help other young people find their way out of the darkness. Sometimes, she reflected, the most important moments in life came disguised as simple choices. A choice to help a stranger, a choice to trust someone who seemed dangerous, a choice to believe that people could change, that families could be formed in unexpected ways, and that love could grow in the most unlikely circumstances. The story that had begun with a desperate woman finding an unconscious young man on a dark street had become something beautiful and complex and real. It had become a life worth living. 5 years had passed since that rainy night when Maria first found Thomas on the street. The small community center where Maria had completed her field placement had grown into something much larger and more ambitious, thanks in large part to funding and support from Second Chances and Patrick's network of contacts. Maria now served as the center's director of family services, overseeing a team of social workers and counselors who worked with families in crisis. The job was demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but it gave her a sense of purpose she had never imagined possible. Every family she helped reminded her of her own journey from desperation to hope. Thomas had graduated with his master's degree and was working as a therapist specializing in childhood trauma. He and Sarah had married the previous year in a small ceremony in the garden behind their house. Patrick had walked Sarah down the aisle at her request. Her own father had died when she was young, and she had come to see Patrick as a father figure. Keisha was now 20 and in her sophomore year at Northwestern University, studying journalism just as she had planned. She still lived with them during school breaks, and she had started writing articles for the community center's newsletter about young people who had overcome difficult circumstances. Her writing was powerful and unflinching, giving voice to experiences that were often ignored by mainstream media. Patrick continued to lead Second Chances, which had expanded to serve 3 different neighborhoods and had become a model for similar programs in other cities. He still carried himself with the confidence of someone who had once wielded real power. But that authority was now channeled into boardroom presentations and fundraising galas rather than intimidation and violence. The family had developed traditions over the years. Sunday dinners where they all gathered to share stories from their week. Annual trips to visit Maria's grandmother's grave, where they would leave flowers and Maria would tell them stories about the woman who had shaped her values. Holiday celebrations that blended elements from all of their backgrounds, creating new traditions that belonged uniquely to them. On this particular evening in early autumn, they were gathered in the living room after dinner, each engaged in their own activities but enjoying the companionable silence of people who were comfortable together. Patrick was reading grant applications. Thomas was preparing for a presentation to new foster parents. Sarah was grading papers. Keisha was working on an article about college access for low-income students. And Maria was reviewing case files for the families she would see the next day. The peaceful scene was interrupted by a phone call. Maria answered, expecting it to be one of her colleagues or perhaps a family in crisis. Instead, she heard a voice she didn't recognize. "Ms. Santos?" My name is Detective Jennifer Walsh with the Chicago Police Department. I'm calling about a case I'm working on, and I was hoping you might be able to help me." Maria felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Even after all these years, phone calls from police made her nervous. "What kind of case?" "I'm investigating a situation involving a teenage boy who was found unconscious in Garfield Park last week. He's been in the hospital and he's awake now, but he won't tell us his name or how he ended up there. One of the nurses mentioned that you sometimes work with kids who are reluctant to trust adults." The situation sounded eerily familiar to Maria. "Has anyone tried to file a missing person report on him?" "That's part of the problem. We've checked all the recent missing person reports and he doesn't match any of them. It's like he doesn't exist in our system at all." Maria looked around the room at her family, all of whom had stopped what they were doing to listen to her side of the conversation. She could see recognition in their eyes. They all understood the parallel to their own story. "I can come to the hospital tomorrow," Maria said, "but I can't promise anything. Some kids have been hurt so badly that they've learned not to trust anyone." "I understand, but you come highly recommended. Dr. Rodriguez at Children's Memorial said you have a gift for reaching kids that other people can't connect with." After Maria hung up the phone, the family discussed the situation. Patrick, with his years of experience reading people and situations, had some theories about what might have happened to the boy. "Kids don't just appear out of nowhere," he said thoughtfully. "If he's not in the missing person database, it probably means one of two things. Either his family hasn't reported him missing because they don't want police attention, or he's been living on his own for long enough that no one knows he's gone. Or he's running from something," Thomas added quietly. "Maybe something so bad that he thinks being alone and hurt is safer than going home." The next morning, Maria drove to the hospital with a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. She had worked with hundreds of troubled teenagers over the years, but something about this case reminded her too strongly of her own family's origin story. The boy was in a room on the pediatric ward, staring out the window when Maria knocked on the door. He looked to be about 16, with dark hair and olive skin that suggested Latino heritage. His arms were covered with bruises in various stages of healing, and there was a bandage on his forehead where he had been injured in whatever incident had landed him in the hospital. "Hi," Maria said softly, settling into the chair beside his bed. "I'm Maria. I'm a social worker. The police asked me to come talk with you, but I want you to know that I'm not here to force you to do anything you don't want to do." The boy looked at her with eyes that were far too old for his face. Maria recognized that look. It was the same expression she had seen in the mirror during her own hardest years, and in Keisha's eyes when she first moved in with them. "They want to know my name," he said quietly. "They want to know where I came from and who I belong to." "What do you want?" Maria asked. The question seemed to surprise him. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what do you want to happen next? What would make you feel safe?" The boy was quiet for a long time, studying Maria's face as if trying to decide whether he could trust her. Finally, he spoke. "I want to disappear," he said. "I want to go somewhere where no one can find me and start over with a new name and a new life." "That's a hard thing to do when you're 16, Maria said gently. "And expensive. And lonely. It's better than going back." "Going back where?" Another long silence. Then in a voice barely above a whisper, "To my uncle. After my parents died, I went to live with him. He hurt me in ways I can't talk about. I finally got brave enough to run away, but I didn't have anywhere to go. I've been living on the streets for 3 months." Maria felt her heart break for this boy, just as it had broken for Keisha and countless other young people she had worked with over the years. But she also felt something else, a sense of possibility, a recognition of an opportunity to complete a circle that had begun 5 years ago when she found Thomas, unconscious and alone. "What's your name?" she asked quietly. "Miguel," he said after a moment. "Miguel Restrepo. Miguel, I want to tell you about my family. It's not a normal family, and we found each other in unusual ways. But we've learned that sometimes the best families are the ones you choose, not the ones you're born into." Over the next hour, Maria told Miguel about Patrick and Thomas and Sarah and Keisha. She told him about her own childhood, about losing her parents and struggling to survive. She told him about the night she found Thomas and how that single act of compassion had led to everything good in her current life. "I'm not saying you should trust us immediately," she concluded. "Trust has to be earned. But I am saying that there are alternatives to disappearing. There are people who understand what you've been through and who might be able to help you build a different kind of life. Miguel listened without interrupting, his expression shifting from suspicion to curiosity to something that might have been hope. Would they really want someone like me? He asked finally. Someone who's been damaged? Miguel, Maria said firmly. Every single person in my family has been damaged in some way. That's not what defines us. What defines us is how we choose to heal and how we choose to help each other. That evening, Maria brought Patrick and Thomas to the hospital to meet Miguel. She had learned over the years that sometimes young people needed to see that there were men who could be trusted. Men who used their strength to protect rather than harm. Patrick, drawing on his years of experience reading people, understood immediately what Miguel needed. He didn't try to be overly friendly or reassuring. Instead, he was simply present and solid, a steady presence that communicated safety without demanding immediate trust. Thomas shared his own story of loss and recovery, speaking honestly about the depression and anger he had experienced after his mother's death. He talked about the way grief could make you feel like you were drowning, and how healing was possible but took time and patience. By the end of the visit, Miguel had agreed to come stay with them on a temporary basis while the social services department worked out the legal details of his situation. It would be a trial period for everyone, a chance to see if this unusual family could expand to include one more person who needed healing. As they drove home that night, Maria reflected on the strange symmetry of their lives. 5 years ago, she had been a desperate woman who found hope by helping a stranger. Now that stranger had become her son in every way that mattered, and together they were offering the same hope to another lost young person. Do you think it will work? Thomas asked from the passenger seat. Taking in Miguel? I think it has to work, Maria replied. Not because it will be easy, but because some kids never get a single chance to be part of a real family. Miguel has been through hell, but he's still fighting. That tells me he's got the strength to heal if we give him the right environment. Patrick, who was driving, nodded in agreement. Besides, we've gotten pretty good at being a family for people who need one. Miguel won't be our first rescue, and he probably won't be our last. As they pulled into their driveway, Maria could see Keisha and Sarah through the living room window, preparing the guest room for Miguel's arrival the next day. This house had become a place where broken people could come to heal, where lost young people could find their way to a better future. The story that had begun with Maria's simple decision to help a stranger had grown into something much larger, a legacy of compassion that would continue to touch lives for years to come. Each person they helped would go on to help others, creating ripples of kindness that would spread far beyond anything Maria could have imagined that night when she first knelt beside an unconscious young man on a dark street. Standing in her driveway, looking at the warm light spilling from the windows of her home, Maria understood that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for all those years ago. She had found her purpose, her people, and her place in the world. And tomorrow she would help another lost soul find theirs.